to San Francisco fairly regularly, a few times a year usually. I grew up in Sacramento, and so it wasn't too far of a drive. We would go over there to go see a concert or ride the cable cars or look at a new museum or a park or whatever it was, but we went over a few times a year. And whenever we went over from Sacramento, the most convenient way for us to go was to drive over the Bay Bridge. And I always thought that was fun. Go through the toll plaza, go through the island in the middle and see the water, and it was a fun way to go. A couple times we went to go see some relatives in the South Bay, and so we went across the San Mateo Bridge, which of course is a little different, closer to the water, and then it has that big hill right toward the end, and that was an always fun one. But really went across that one a few times. I have another story, by the way, about the San Mateo Bridge that I'll tell you sometime. It's a riot. Anyway, we'll save that one for another time. But rarely did I ever get to go across the other bridge on the other side, entering the bay, that Golden Gate Bridge. And whenever we did, though, I always thought that it was, extra cool. It's orange, and it's tall, and it's a little bit longer than some of them, and it just feels like it's a grand bridge. It's just a little different than some of the others. For some reason, it just has that feel. Well, it was back in the 1840s that there was a U.S. Army captain who was sailing in these areas, and he had discovered this strait of water underneath where the Golden Gate Bridge now is. Of course, there was no bridge there at the time, but he was using this area and saw how important it was for the military use of the United States. So he saw this region in these mountains and this gorgeous area, and he also realized how important this area was going to be for trade and for commerce and for connecting the West with the East. So this captain wrote in his journal, after standing and seeing some of these things and realizing its importance, he wrote in his journal, "This is a golden gate to trade with the East." And that was the first time Golden Gate had ever been used for that area, and somebody stuck it on a map. And when they stuck it on a map, then the name just got popular. And so a couple decades later, or several decades later, when they started plans for this bridge, of course they had nothing else to call it except the Golden Gate Bridge. And when something is golden, that's something that's rare and precious and valuable and important. Like when a friend gives us advice that's really good, we can say, that is golden advice. That's precious, that's important advice. Or when we have some great opportunity out there that we want to go for, we say, that's a golden opportunity. But what about a rare and a precious and an important and a valuable God? We could call the God who created this world and the God who sent Jesus and the God who offers relationships with us, we can call that God golden. Because the Bible actually talks about God that way. Moses talked about God that way. And throughout the Bible, there's these mentions of God being golden. But what I love about when the Bible talks about God as golden is that it doesn't just say, God is golden, and leave it there. There is so much more to it, and there's so many specifics wrapped around the idea that God is golden. When Moses says this, he gets really specific, and he actually explains why God is golden. He gives evidence, he cites examples, he's throwing out experiences that they've had, things that people understand and know and have seen, and he said, this is why God is golden. And then after that, he even says, and if we live like God is that rare and precious and valuable and important, there's some amazing things that can happen when we do. We started looking last week at this whole idea of golden, God being golden and God's ways being golden. And we talked about commandments and rules and instructions that God gives, and God's desire is that we obey these golden ways of life. And only a golden God could give golden ways for us to follow. All this stuff that we're looking at comes to the book of Deuteronomy. We're looking at this for several more weeks. And if you want to know some background on the book of Deuteronomy, we touched on some of this last week, so you're welcome to be super social media driven, and you can go onto YouTube and find our sermon from last week, and you can learn about what Deuteronomy, how Deuteronomy sat in the life of people in the Old Testament. It was a treasured book. I mean, it was this shining and glimmering kind of book about God and God's ways, and it really captured the heart of who God was and told these stories over and over about God to these people. So, Deuteronomy. We're looking again at chapter 4, and this subject for today is all about what makes God golden and what happens when we live as if God is golden. There's some cool things that Moses says. So it starts with Deuteronomy chapter 4. It's printed in your bulletin, or you can find it in your own Bible if you brought one. But we're going to go section by section. We're not going to read the whole thing. We'll just do piece by piece. The first paragraph is where we'll start. So Moses says, now he's talking to the whole nation of Israel gathered. Now search all of history from the time God created people on the earth until now, and search from one end of the heavens to the other. Has anything as great as this ever been seen or heard before? Has any nation ever heard the voice of God speaking from fire, as you did, and survived? Has any other God dared to take a nation for himself out of another nation by means of trials, miraculous signs, wonders, war, a strong hand, a powerful arm, and terrifying acts? Yet this is what the Lord your God did for you in Egypt, right before your eyes. I think Moses is giving us a challenge. It's almost like a dare. You know, when somebody comes up to you and says, okay, try this. Try to find some God that's bigger, some God that's more powerful, some God that can do more than our God has. Because, and Moses lists them off, he lists off these things that God has done. God has spoken through fire and you saw it. Can you find a more powerful, a bigger, and more amazing God who can do more amazing things than these types of things that you've seen God do? So he cites all these powerful, these big, these majestic kinds of things. And truth and power and majesty, they're good. And God does all those things, and we need those things. But that's not all of what Moses says. Because it's not just that God is doing these powerful things. Look at where God has done these things. Moses says, God spoke to the people, and the people heard God right around them. God chose and worked with a nation of people here in the world. Moses even says, this is what the Lord your God did for you in Egypt, in that country. Everybody knew Egypt. Moses even, God did all these things here, on our turf, where we live, places that we know of and places we can see. And God's showing that God comes to us. See, this is just as true for them as it is for us today. Just about every other religion in their day, and I think most other religions in our day, are all about us trying to get to God. Because God's there, and we're here, and somehow we've got to get from one to the other. And most religions are talking about what we need to do in order to climb, or hike, or move, or somehow get up to God, or to wherever God is. Usually it takes a lot of work. Usually it takes a lot of effort. Usually it's a list of rules and a checklist and a lifetime of other things. And hopefully, someday we might be able to get to heaven, or to perfection, or to enlightenment, or to nirvana, or to whatever any religion might say is that thing, or that God, or that place that we're striving for. And that's not what Moses says. Moses says it's not about us getting there, it's about that God has already come to us. And we didn't do anything. We just got created. And then God said, well, I'm going to come to you. And so God cites all these examples in these ways that God comes to us when we don't deserve it at all. Yet God still comes to us. There have been books and theologies and speeches and classes taught just on that truth alone. People have developed fancy words like incarnation, and these words that try to capture the bigness of God coming to us. And people have talked about this for hours and tomes of books, and series of books and classes. And yet that's just one piece of what Moses talks about. That's just one sliver of what Moses is trying to get across to the nation of Israel, that God comes to us. And then he keeps going. Moses says, He, God, showed you these things so you would know that the Lord is God and there is no other. He let you hear his voice from heaven so he could instruct you. He let you see his great fire here on earth so he could speak to you from it. Because he loved your ancestors, he chose to bless their descendants, and he personally brought you out of Egypt with a great display of power. He drove out nations far greater than you so he could bring you in and give you their land as your special possession as it is today. When we see that God comes to us, I think we see that God isn't done. You know, some religions say that God created the world or somehow the world was made, and then it just started spinning and it set in motion and God doesn't touch it. God did not create our world and then just decided to kick back and watch. I mean, God comes here and God is involved in this world that God created. God doesn't let it just go. God's involved. And as Moses says, God does things. You know, God shows and God speaks and God acts and God loves. God blesses. God moves. God brings. God gives. Moses finishes this with the fact that God did all these things in the past, but that's not it. That God is still doing all of these things. These weren't just things that God happened to do a long time ago or he did a generation ago. These are things that still God does. And so Moses, I think, is highlighting the fact that it's not just that God was or God used to be, but that God is. How many of you have a pet or have had a pet? Okay, do you remember naming your pet? Because every pet has to have a name, right? You remember naming your pet. Now, when you named your pet, did you just come up with the name? Did you think about the name? Did you think long and hard about the name? Did you worry about names? I mean, was it a hard process to come up with a name? How many was it easy to come up with your name? How many was it hard to come up with your name? You thought, well, okay, good. Parents, when you named your children, was it an easy thing or did you take a long time to do it? I mean, easy thing? Just pop out with a name? Yeah, a few of you did. Yeah, you're the pros. But oftentimes we look through books and we find all these different names and these ideas and we think, well, that one doesn't fit and that one doesn't fit, that one doesn't sound right, that's a strange name, that one's a really good name, and we make our short list and then we keep whittling it down and we choose names because we want these names to fit. You know, who are pets or who are kids, or we want it to fit who we are and who we believe that God created them to be. We want it to be the right kind of name. Interestingly, for the first few chapters of the Bible, God did not have a name. I mean, God was called God, or Lord, or Master. You know, they were very generic kinds of names. It's almost like calling your dog, dog, or calling your cat, cat, or calling your child, kid. I mean, God didn't have a name. And the names that are in the Bible for God in those first chapters are, these names that are just God. And so God didn't have a name until God got really personal with Abraham. And when he got really personal, God revealed a name. It's almost as if God introduced himself to Abraham and said, "Hi, it's great to meet you. My name is Yahweh." And Abraham was like, "I've never heard the name Yahweh before." Because it was a brand new name. The name was like no other name that existed, but I mean, if we were Abraham and we heard it, I guarantee the thing we'd be thinking is, oh, wait a minute, I've heard that before. And the reason is because God's name that he introduced sounds almost exactly like another word. And the other word that it sounds almost exactly like is the verb to be. You know, something is, or I am, or that thing is, or God is. It's just that verb to be. So when God introduced himself, you know, God's like, "Hey, my name's Yahweh, I'm Yahweh, who are you?" It's almost like, I am. Or, oh, this is just who I am. And so, you know, in Abraham's mind, he's thinking, okay, this God is am, or is. I mean, how cool is that God's name is. I mean, it's not has been, it's is. So whenever we say God's name, we're basically proclaiming the fact that God is. And I think if Moses was to encourage us in some sort of a way, it might be, those times we say, God's not answering my prayers, or I don't feel like God is near, or I'm just wondering what's going on with God. God's not showing up. God's not doing what I asked. God's not dealing with this person or this situation like I prefer. God's not whatever. It's like Moses is saying, hey, guess what? God is. So no matter how we think or we feel, God is. And God will always be. It's part of his name. It's just part of who he is. Then Moses keeps going. Next paragraph. So remember this and keep it firmly in mind. The Lord is God, both in heaven and on earth, and there is no other. If you obey all the decrees and commands I am giving you today, all will be well with you and your children. I am giving you these instructions so you will enjoy a long life in the land the Lord your God is giving you for all time. If you're ever reading your Bible and you see Lord in all those capital letters, and you think, well, that's weird. Why are there capital letters there? When most of our Bibles put Lord in capital letters, that means this Yahweh name, this I am name, this God is name, it means that's the name that's being used. There's other places where Lord or God or Master are being used, but this is like the personal specific name. So whenever you see the capitals, think, okay, this is personal God who's doing this thing. So, back to this passage. Where does Yahweh, or this God, act as God, according to what Moses says? Because most religions in Moses' day, just like we had mentioned, they talk about God existing mostly up there. If God exists anywhere, God exists in heaven, or in the ethereal realm, or in the cosmos, or somewhere else, but it's just not here. And Moses specifically says, the Lord is God both in heaven and on earth. In other words, God doesn't just reign there in heaven that we might get to experience someday. God actually reigns here. And we get to experience it now. And I think that sounds really cool that God reigns here and God is powerful here and now, but I think we got to ask, well, how? And when? And how do we know that God is reigning here? How do we see it? How does God show it? And the cool thing is, I think God has answered this question generation after generation. For them, in Moses' day, he answered it by taking them to the promised land. Because for them, that was the land that was pure and safe and free. It was intimate with God. It was bountiful. It was everything that they looked for in God's blessings. So they looked at that land and said, oh, God's reigning. God's here. God's providing for us. They saw it around them. In the days that the New Testament was written, or just before that, Jesus was the answer to this. If God is reigning here, then God sent himself here. And God proved through Jesus that yes, God exists. And then forever after that, God said, well, I've got to keep proving this, that I'm reigning here. So God sends the Spirit. And in this mysterious way, we get the Spirit that confirms or gives wisdom or teaches us, or however the Spirit works, to prove that God still is reigning here. Because God comes to us, God is, and God reigns here. Why is God golden? Because of these things. Because pretty much God exists and reigns here with us. So, if we live in a way where God is golden, and we see that, and we affirm it, we live it out, what happens? This is where Moses ends this little speech, and I think it's awesome. If you obey all the decrees and commands I've given you today, all will be well with you and your children. I am giving you these instructions so you will enjoy a long life in the land the Lord your God is giving you for all time. Now that sounds like, prosperity and perfection. If we obey, then God will make everything perfect. And clearly that's not the case. Because the most perfect person doesn't have the perfect life. It just doesn't happen that way. And every one of us can raise our hands and testify to the fact that even on our best days, life is not perfect. And I don't think that's at all what Moses is saying. He's not saying that if we do this, then we have a perfect life. It's never formulaic. What it does mean, I think, is when we live in ways like God is a golden God, when we follow God's ways, when we affirm all these things about God, and when we honor God with all of ourselves, then somehow God seals a relationship between us and God. It's not just, though, my relationship with God is if I do all these things and God seals a relationship and so I'm good with God. Or you do some great things and your relationship with God is really clean and good. Because when Moses says, in this passage, what he says is, all will be well with you and your children. I'm giving these instructions so you, plural, nation of Israel, will enjoy a long life in the land your Lord is giving you. What Moses is talking about is when we live in such a way that affirms that God is who God is, God blesses a relationship between us and other people, where people can look at our lives and say, wait, something's happening there. And they can see that something's happening in our lives, and they might be able to discover something. And I think God's greatest hope is when people see us living in a way that affirms God in our lives, that they then discover this same golden God. January 24th, 1848 was the day that James Marshall made the discovery that changed California. And he discovered what? He discovered gold. That's right, he found a shiny few flakes in a stream in California, and he was immediately sure that it was gold. So what did he do? He told people. He spread the word, I found gold. And some people believed it, and some people said, you're crazy. And they didn't believe it. Some people went and hunted for it, but it didn't become a big thing until the next year, 1949. And these thousands and thousands of people started mortgaging their houses and selling their stuff and traveling all over to California. All these people called the 49ers. And the population of California went from 20,000 to 300,000 in the span of a few years. It changed that much because people discovered gold. And I think God's mission forever has been that people discover this kind of God. Jesus' mission, if it was ever a mission, was that people discover this kind of God. Our church's mission is, if we ever had one, was that people discover this kind of a God. Because when we live in such a way that affirms that God is this kind of a God, then that's an opportunity for others to see it and say, that's the kind of God that is amazing. And maybe I can serve him too. So may it be that as we serve a golden God, that others might discover gold too.